In October 2011, animal control records from a rural county in Montana showed something strange. Within 3 weeks, the number of missing livestock reports tripled. Goats, pigs, turkeys, even dogs were vanishing from small farms. Most cases had the same details: no broken fences, no blood, and no clear tracks leading away from the pens. At first, it looked like paperwork noise, a bad month for coyotes, or a new pack of wolves moving through the area. Then one report mentioned a tall, thin thing in the field. 3 days later, another described something moving on 3 legs near a chicken coop at 2 a.m. Those lines were crossed out in ink before the forms were filed. The originals were never scanned. This story comes from an unofficial account written by a man who lived on the edge of those woods. For this episode, we'll call him Nate. He had returned to his late mother's house that summer. The place sat on the outskirts of a small town, backed directly by a wall of dense pine forest. A narrow strip of field ran between his yard and the tree line. On the other side of the property line, small farms stretched out in uneven rectangles. Turkey pens, goat sheds, rusted tractors sinking into the dirt. By early fall, Nate had settled into a simple routine. He fixed what he could around the house. He hunted deer and small game in the surrounding woods. He sold some of the meat to locals, kept the rest, and slowly rebuilt a life that felt quieter and more solid than what he had left behind. The first sign that something was wrong came as a pattern, not a single event. A neighbor's goats disappeared without disturbing the fence. Another neighbor lost most of their turkeys overnight. The pen door hung half open in the morning, latch twisted, feathers scattered in the dirt, but no torn bodies, no blood trail. A dog chained in a yard on the next road over was simply gone before dawn. Chain snapped, collar left swinging from the post. The usual suspects were blamed: coyotes, stray dogs, maybe a cougar moving closer to town. But the details didn't fit. Predators left sign: tracks, droppings, drag marks, torn carcasses. These scenes often had none of that. It was as if something had stepped into the world, taken what it wanted, and stepped back out without disturbing anything but a lock and a hinge. Nate heard the stories at the small town diner and the feed store. He listened, nodded, and told himself that fear made people exaggerate. Missing animals were part of country life. Predators took chances when the weather turned and food grew scarcer. He kept hunting, kept walking the same trails, and pretended the tension in people's voices didn't bother him. One late afternoon, that changed. It was near the end of November. The sun had just dropped behind the pines, leaving the fields in flat, gray light. Frost was already forming on the dead grass near the ditch lines. Nate was cutting across the backfield toward his house, rifle slung over his shoulder, a small game bag thumping lightly against his side. He glanced left. Something was standing in the middle of the open field about 60 yards away. At first, his mind tried to turn it into a tree stump or a broken fence post. Something ordinary. It stood too still for anything alive. Then his eyes adjusted, and the shape refused to stay harmless. It was tall and narrow, its torso stretched long and thin. 3 limbs reached the ground, 2 roughly where legs should be, and a third emerging from higher on the body, jointed in a way that didn't match any animal Nate knew. The whole figure was hunched, its spine bowed like it had been pulled tight from both ends. There was no visible fur, no clothing. The surface of it looked like bare, gray skin, pulled over bone. It didn't sway in the breeze. The grass around its limbs moved as the wind passed, but the thing itself stayed perfectly still, like a figure carved from stone and dropped into the field. For several seconds, Nate could not move. The usual rhythm of identification, deer, coyote, person, never finished. Every instinct screamed predator, but not a kind he'd ever prepared for. He did not raise the rifle. The idea of aiming at it felt like stepping off the edge of a roof. He forced himself to keep walking. He fixed his eyes on the ground ahead, counting his steps, waiting for a shout, a rush, any sound behind him. When he finally looked back, the field where it had been standing was empty. The grass was undisturbed. No dark shape, no figure moving toward the tree line, no sign that anything had been there at all. He thought about turning around and crossing the distance, looking for prints or flattened stalks, anything tangible to prove he hadn't imagined it. Instead, he went home, locked the door earlier than usual, and lay awake longer than he wanted to admit. The missing animals didn't stop. Over the next week, reports intensified. One farm woke up to find nearly an entire flock of turkeys gone, leaving only a few broken feathers near the far fence. Another found a pig pen empty, gate latched, trough tipped over. Something was removing living, struggling animals from enclosures meant to keep them safe, and doing it without leaving the mess predators usually left behind. Nate avoided talking about what he had seen in the field. Without proof, it sounded like a story invented after too many nights of bad sleep. Then, one cold, windless night, the county crossed a line. A 14-year-old boy stepped out into his family's yard to bring leftovers to the dog tied near the back porch. It was just after 9. His parents were in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. They heard a short, strangled cry, and then nothing. When they ran outside, the dog was cowering under the porch, chains snapped. The bowl sat tipped on its side. Their son's shoes lay in the dirt, still neatly side by side, as if he'd stepped out of them. Beyond the yard, in the direction of the fields, they saw only darkness. Search parties formed. Volunteers swept the tree line with flashlights until dawn. No tracks, no clothing, no body. The boy's disappearance was followed, days later, by something worse. A family Nate knew, a couple in their 30s with 2 young children, failed to appear in town. They didn't answer calls. When the sheriff entered their home, he found broken windows, overturned furniture, and blood in multiple rooms. The parents were dead. Both had their necks broken. The children were gone. Panic settled over the town like a second winter. People who had laughed off early stories now bolted their doors, nailed boards over ground floor windows, and kept guns within reach of their beds. Rumors hardened into something closer to belief. There was something in the woods and fields that did not fear people, did not fear dogs, and did not kill the way normal animals killed. By then, the stories had a name for it. Some called it the 3-legged thing. Others just called it that thing. Nate tried to keep distance between himself and the hysteria. But one night, about a week after the family was found, he woke to a sound outside his bedroom window. Not scratching, not howling. Footsteps. 3 beats, then a pause. 3 beats, then a pause. They moved slowly along the side of the house, right beneath the window frame. The boards of the old porch gave a shallow, rhythmic creak, as if something heavy and careful was distributing its weight across an extra point of contact. He held his breath and listened as the steps reached the corner and faded away toward the back of the house. The dog 2 properties over, which barked at every passing pickup truck, made no sound. The next morning, Nate found nothing obvious in the mud near his foundation. The frost had turned the ground stiff, but in the thin layer of thaw near the edge of his yard, he saw something that didn't match any of his boots, or his neighbors, or any animal prints he knew. 3 elongated depressions, spaced in a way that matched a stride slightly longer than his own. No clear toes, no detailed shape, just smooth, deep ovals pressed into the soil, then gone. That same afternoon, a group of men in town agreed to go into the woods. They knew roughly where the thing liked to approach from. Most of the missing livestock cases and late-night sightings clustered around the same stretch of trees, near an old ravine behind a fallow field. It was not a place hunters favored, even before the disappearances. The ground stayed wet and cold there. The trees grew too close together. Birds flew over, but rarely landed. 10 men went in with rifles and shotguns. They followed an informal grid, keeping each other in sight, heading toward the ravine where the land dipped out of view. The temperature felt lower under the trees. The wind they'd felt in the field died, replaced by a heavy stillness. The forest floor was slick with decaying needles and patches of black mud. As they approached the ravine, the smell reached them first. It was not the ordinary scent of death that hunters knew, the sharp, almost sour odor of a deer left too long in the sun. This was thicker, older, layered. Rot sweetened by time and pressure, rising in waves that made eyes water and stomachs roll. When they reached the edge and looked down, they saw why. The ravine was filled with bodies. Not in any pattern, not arranged, just thrown in. Deer in various stages of decay, cows missing limbs, dogs, goats, raccoons, turkeys, wild pigs, all piled together in a slow, sinking mass of flesh and bone. Flies boiled over exposed organs. White ribs jutted up like broken pickets. Feathers stuck to fur and skin, forming clotted mats. Near one side, half buried under a deer carcass and a tangle of branches, lay a human form. A rib cage. A skull with patches of hair still clinging. Bones picked almost clean. The men at the edge of the ravine understood, without anyone having to say it, that this was not just an animal's feeding pit. It was a disposal site for anything and everything that creature had dragged away. They pulled one of their own out of the pile when the ground under his feet gave way and he slid down, thrashing in panic as he struggled to avoid the slick, yielding remains beneath him. By the time they hauled him back up, he was covered to the waist in fluids and rot. They sent him home with orders to burn his clothes and scrub his skin raw. The rest pressed on. The woods beyond the ravine were worse. The trees leaned in strange angles, many of them dead or half-dead, trunks scarred and black, branches mostly bare. The canopy nodded overhead, blocking what little daylight remained. The air felt compressed, as if something heavy had settled over that patch of forest and never left. They moved forward slowly. Boots sank into cold, soaked soil that sometimes felt disturbingly firm, like there was stone or something else only a few inches below the surface. They did not see the first attack. They heard it. A wet, strangled yell from the back of the line, cut short mid-breath. Branches snapped. Something heavy collided with a tree trunk. When they turned, one of their own was gone from his position, leaving only a faint impression where his boots had been. They pushed back through the tight weave of trees toward the sound, hearts hammering, guns up. They broke into a narrow clearing just in time to see it. The three-legged thing hung from a low branch for a moment, then dropped to the ground with a sound like wet canvas hitting stone. In its jaws, clamped high near the neck, it held a man. Blood ran in thick lines down the thing's chin onto its chest. The man's hands twitched once and went still. The creature's body was fully visible now. It was taller than any of them when fully upright, easily 8 feet from the crown of its head to where its longer limb met the ground. Its torso was gaunt, ribs visible beneath tight gray skin that looked almost translucent in places. 2 limbs resembled legs, jointed in roughly the right places, but too long, with feet that ended in broad, blunt pads. The third limb emerged higher, like an arm that had been pulled from the shoulder down to mid-torso. It was longer than the others, ending in a pale, 5-fingered hand that dug into the dirt with obscene strength. Its head was huge compared to its body. Eyes black and oversized, set deep in a face that was almost human in outline, but stretched and lengthened beyond recognition. The nose was narrow and long. The jaw hinged farther back than it should, packed with thick, pointed teeth that interlocked when it closed its mouth. It made no vocal sound. For a frozen second, predator and hunting party stared at each other across the clearing. Then the guns fired. Shotgun blasts tore into its torso. Rifle rounds punched holes along its limbs and shoulders. Puffs of gray tissue and something darker burst from the impact points. No blood sprayed the ground. The wounds remained as matte, black voids, as if bullets had blown pieces of it into absence instead of tearing them open. The creature staggered and dropped the body in its jaws. Its long limb flailed, pawing at the air. Its legs folded and unfolded in angles that made no biological sense. A second volley hit. It collapsed fully, limbs jerking, head snapping back against the ground. The air filled with the echo of shots. One of the men stepped forward carefully and pressed the barrel of his shotgun against the side of its head. He fired. The impact rocked the creature's skull sideways. When the smoke cleared, its skin was unbroken. He hit it again, this time with the butt of the gun. The sound that came back was not flesh on bone, but metal on stone. Under the stretched, pale surface, the thing felt as hard and cold as rock. They looped a rope around its upper body, wary of letting their hands rest too long on its skin. Several men claimed that even brief contact left their fingers numb and chilled to the bone. They tied the other end of the rope to an ATV that had been left at the edge of the woods and began to drag. Even limp, the creature weighed far more than its size suggested. The ATV engine strained, tires spinning against roots and mud. The men pushed from behind, boots slipping, lungs burning in the damp air. They made it perhaps 50 yards. The rope suddenly sagged. The strain vanished so abruptly that the men pushing stumbled forward. When they looked back, the three-legged thing was no longer attached to the loop. The rope still formed a perfect circle, tightened as if around a neck that no longer existed. The ground where the body had dragged a groove through the mud stopped at a clean line, and beyond that, there was nothing. No drag trail, no footprints. One moment it had been there, the next it was not. In the days that followed, outside authorities arrived. State officers, wildlife investigators, men not in uniform who did not offer clear credentials. They closed off the ravine. They removed the bodies in heavy bags. They collected soil samples, photographed the area, and took statements from the men who had gone into the woods, though those statements eventually disappeared from local records. Officially, the county faced a cluster of predator attacks and an ongoing investigation into violent crime. No mention was made of anything with 3 limbs or stone-hard skin. No explanation was given for why some of the removed remains showed signs of being stripped clean far faster than normal decay allowed. Unofficially, people in that town changed how they lived. They nailed boards over ground floor windows on the side facing the woods. They kept their animals inside at night or moved them to pens closer to the house. They stopped letting their children walk alone across the fields after dark. Nate stopped hunting completely. He kept his rifle, cleaned and ready, but it stayed in the cabinet. He reported hearing the same pattern of steps outside his house on several more occasions after the woods search. Always at night. Always 3 beats, then a pause, moving slowly past his windows, never breaking into a run, never scratching at the walls. He never saw it again directly. But one winter morning, after a night of those footsteps, he found a single mark pressed deep into the frozen ground near the edge of his yard. It was long, smooth, and narrow. Not a boot, not a hoof, not a paw. More like something heavy had balanced on a single, cold, stone limb for a moment before pushing off into the trees. According to the records that still exist, the disappearances in that part of Montana tapered off over the next year. Livestock attacks dropped to normal levels. No more children went missing from their yards. The 3-legged thing became a story told in low voices, a warning for kids who wanted to run out into the fields at night, a shadow in the corner of hunters' memories when the forest grew too quiet. But every now and then, someone still reports finding 3 deep impressions in the snow where nothing should have walked, or hearing careful, unhurried steps moving past their house on nights when the wind is dead and the pines stand perfectly still. And in a closed file drawer, in a county office that never made the digital transition, there is still a page that was never meant to be read outside that room. The top of the form reads, "Cause of livestock loss, unknown." Below that, in handwriting that presses hard enough to dent the paper, someone has crossed out "coyote" and written 2 words: 3 legs.